Two things drive me crazy above all else: poor communication and wasted time. And I remember not that long ago when I started out on my own and not having a formal mentor myself, I was always trying to find a group of people to get around so I could challenge my own ideas, get some new ideas, and just have some different folks to relate to. And I'll admit, like as a guy, the options were few and far between. It felt like anytime I looked for a mastermind or a group of people, it was one of two sides, right? It was either kind of a rah-rah group where every day you were just supposed to talk about what you were grateful for and no practical strategies came out of it. Or it was this billionaire boys club kind of thing where it was like 10x your business, make money, drive Lamborghinis. None of those appealed to me. What I was looking for is something where I could be around people who were respectful, knew how to listen, but would also call you out on your BS if they smelled it. And it didn't exist. So we created our Coalition program. This is our 6-month program where you get direct mentoring from me and others from a wide variety of professions. We've had people in pharmaceuticals, we've had people in coaching, we've had people in various leadership positions throughout industries, and we come together bi-monthly to have discussions related to business, our personal lives, any aspect of your craft. Literally anything goes. Age doesn't matter, gender doesn't matter, background, experience doesn't matter. All that matters is that you want to come and help other people in the group. I only do this twice a year. It is an application-based thing, and there is skin in the game. Listen, I've done plenty of free stuff like this in the past, and what ends up happening is you just have 40 to 50 people on some call, barely anybody gets to talk, and since nobody paid, people don't really share. They don't speak up. They don't do anything because there's no cost to them if they don't participate. We keep this small. We go sometimes 5 to no more than 15 people, and we have 4 spots left. So if you are interested, make sure to go to artofcoaching.com/coalition now. Also, our episode today is brought to you by Momentous. From grass-fed whey protein, plant-based options, collagen peptides, and their elite sleep formula, Momentous is my absolute go-to whenever I'm traveling or recommending some sort of nutritional insurance to members of my family. My folks are getting older, and I'm thinking about this right now because it's almost Mother's Day and it's going to be my father's birthday soon. And my dad especially is the type that will tinker all day like Mr. Magoo instead of just sitting down for a meal. And he doesn't get enough protein. So this isn't a meathead thing. This is, the stuff that I recommend to my athletes, to executives, and to my family. And as an Art of Coaching listener, you can get 25% off your first purchase of Momentous when you sign up for a subscription and 15% off all subsequent orders. All you need to do is go to livemomentous.com and use code BRETT25 at checkout. Again, that's BRETT25 at checkout to receive this offer. Welcome to the Art of Coaching podcast, a show aimed at getting to the core of what it takes to change attitudes, behaviors, and outcomes in the weight room, boardroom, classroom, and everywhere in between. I'm your host, Brett Bartholomew. I'm a performance coach, keynote speaker, and the author of the book, Conscious Coaching. But most importantly, I'm a lifelong student interested in all aspects of human behavior and communication. I want to thank you for joining me, and now let's dive into today's episode. Hey everyone, today I sit down with Courtney Kelly. Courtney's a writer and editor who partners with individuals and organizations alike to create brands, products, books, and other media that aim to affect real prosocial change. Before starting her freelance business, Ethos Alchemy, during the summer of 2020, she served as the marketing director for Strength Ratio, a strength and conditioning and sport performance company, and as a curriculum director for Strivven Media, an Asheville, North Carolina-based education technology company. Quite the range. She began her career as an English teacher, and writing education remains central to her work today. I couldn't be happier to bring you this conversation with Courtney. Let's get into it. Courtney, thanks for joining me.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one for a lot of reasons. We've known each other for a little bit now, never met, truly face to face, but we're connected by a mutual friend in Brad Stolberg. And I think it was our first conversation really where we talked about our mutual affinity for language and communication and words. And one thing that our audience would have heard in the intro, as long as they didn't skip it, is you have a background in psycholinguistics. And that's a deep rabbit hole in and of itself. But talk to me a little bit about how you came to be somebody who has this deep appreciation for the words we use and how we wield them and communication in general.
Yeah. And first I would say, I wasn't someone who got like a master's degree in psycholinguistics or a PhD or anything like that. I'm more just someone who's fascinated by it and whose work is impacted by it every day. But really, where I first I was first introduced to it by a linguist named John McWhorter. He wrote a book called Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, which is the history of English. And if you're interested in the history of language, anything like that, I cannot recommend this book enough. It is hilarious. It's riveting. And I'm not just saying that as someone that likes words. I think anyone would like it. So anyway, through that book, I started to, or that book shaped kind of my understanding of what language actually is and how it actually works. And it kind of shifted my thinking away from this like antiquated approach to language, which is so focused on like prescriptive grammar. Are you splitting infinitives, or do your verbs match your nouns, and all of these little things that are nitpicky and honestly like had always felt a little bit superficial to me. So it was cool to have this new approach to language that saw it as this like ever evolving social agreement. And so from there became really interested in pursuing just more about language itself. And I was working as a teacher. So I was really interested in like understanding how we acquire language, where there can be some like road bumps in the process, and why there can be some differences in like how people are using it, how people are perceiving it, where that comes from, essentially. Like I wanted to know that sort of the biological like underpinnings of language. So I started really deep diving. I actually applied to a PhD program and did not get in. This was at Hopkins, a cognitive science program. But through the work I did for the application and the interview, and via the people that I met and the work that I was exposed to, I just learned a lot more than I had known before about, the neurological underpinnings of language itself, and the entire process of using language, producing it, processing it, perceiving it, and how it evolves. So that's kind of my background there.
No, and I appreciate that. I think something, again, if our listeners heard the intro and we'll talk about this, but it's unique too, because not only are you a fellow nerd about these things, but you also are involved in weightlifting and competing in powerlifting. And so we're going to go a coaching route here in a minute, but let's stay on language for a second. It's interesting to me, and I'd love to get your take on this, because one discussion we were having as a staff recently is around, why people tend to think they're better at wielding language or communicating and understanding these things than they are. Now, most of our audience has heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. We're aware of the better than average effect, right? We all think that we're a little bit better at certain things than we are. And one member of our staff and an extended member of our audience was like, well, it's funny. It's kind of like everybody communicates, so they think they're good at it. Just like a lot of people eat food, so they think they know something about nutrition or, what have you. And, what do you think it is, one, that makes people think that they're better at understanding these things than they are? And two, in your research and your own curiosity, what were some things you were surprised to learn about yourself where you had inadequacies or massive imperfections that you were like, whoa, I need to work on these a little bit?
Yeah, I love those questions. Honestly, with that first one, the initial answer that comes to mind is when we communicate, there's this bidirectionality to our theories of mind that happens, or our theory of mind, if it's two people, I guess two theories of minds. But essentially, like when you're speaking, you're thinking about how someone's perceiving your language, but you're also thinking about the fact that they're thinking about the fact that you're thinking about their language. So, which sounds complicated, but essentially, like both parties in a conversation, both or anybody that's in sort of like a communication relationship, they are not only putting themselves in the other person's shoes, but they're also imagining that person putting themselves in their shoes. So there's, again, it's that bidirectionality. And I think what can happen there is if, for a number of reasons, there can be kind of like a mismatch, and you can think that someone's perceiving you a certain way, or assume that someone assumes you're perceiving them a certain way and be wrong. And I think when you get enough feedback from people that, if they're not necessarily correcting you, or you're not asking questions to verify that your assumptions or your perceptions are correct, then there's nothing that's telling you that the mismatch has occurred. And so you'll continue to assume that you're correct, and just keep applying that across the board with your kind of communication. So I think that's kind of like a big part of it is actively seeking out that feedback in conversations, like, hey, did that make sense to you, or was that clear? And not asking in a way that's like kind of putting someone on the spot, but just genuinely asking for feedback can really help people, like the general you, kind of refine their theory of mind, that process of like abstraction.
Yeah. And I think just to break up that before you go on to the second part, you brought up some wonderful things there, and we're going to dive into theory of mind here in a moment. But I would even add, not just getting feedback, but getting feedback from people that are not your family, friends, or direct colleagues.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
We have to have diverse levels of feedback, because it's amazing how many people, and I always make a disclaimer, anything I give people a hard time about, I'm guilty of plenty myself, right? But like and so like, I think there are so many coaches that I've ran into and leaders that think that communication took place just because they told somebody something, right? Or that they're good at it because it's something they do daily. And I said, oh, well, there's a lot of things we do daily that we're abysmal at. When they say, well, I communicate daily, I'm like, so does everybody else in the world. And how are they at it? But it is fascinating, because that goes into theory of mind, right? Like my 15-month-old doesn't occur to him that deception's possible, right? He thinks that everyone knows what he knows right now, and he doesn't know any, so it's fascinating that people think, oh, I've said something, so they must have understood it. No, we have differing thoughts. That's what you mean by theory of mind, right? Or do you care to elaborate? Could you elaborate on that a little bit for audience members that maybe haven't heard that term?
Yeah, totally. And I think it's a great example actually to bring in your 15-month-old, because it's something that you have massive development with in those early years of your life. But theory of mind is just, it's called a theory because it's like your understanding of someone else's perception. And you can't ever know for sure what someone else is perceiving unless you're in their shoes. So that's why it's called a theory, because no matter what, you're always theorizing. And most of the time you have enough information to make like a really educated, spot on theory that's probably going to be right. But at the end of the day, we aren't able to jump into one another's perspectives. So it's still theory. And how the reason that theory of mind is such a big deal for like young children is because, I don't know if you can hear my dog.
You're fine.
Is because so it is a foundation for communication. You can't communicate unless you can think about someone perceiving that. Well, you can communicate, but it's more things like, I'm cold, so move me, or like, or like, I'm hungry, that kind of thing. But so with a growing kind of developing brain, there's so much activity that's going on around kind of interactions that children have with their parents or even other children, and like their siblings or what have you. And this over time is helping to shape their understanding that other people have experiences. I mean, A, that they have experiences, B, that they could be different than theirs, C, that they have beliefs, and then D, that those beliefs can also be different. And so typically, I mean, usually people's theory of mind is extremely well developed, before they're teenagers and stuff. But there can be some like aberrant things that happen with theory of mind throughout development. And, I think it's one of those things like anything else that has to do with psychology, neurology, any skill, it's something that needs to be like practiced. We do it automatically, but in terms of like really kind of taking your understanding of someone else to the next level, that can be a practice.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where I would say some people, the disconnect is when we say, well, we need to improve our communication or interpersonal skills, they look at it as some kind of vagary, right? As opposed to understanding that there's levels to it. And this is kind of where we can get into training analogies, right? Like I don't just start using bands and chains with beginners in strength training, right? Or if somebody's competing for if they're going to do a marathon, they don't just start running off like a ridiculous amount of mileage. I mean, they might, but they're going to end up having shin splints or maybe plantar fasciitis. And there's so many different things. So the thing that I tried to encourage, and I wonder if this is within your framework as well, of, when we say communication, if you're trying to grow a business, if you're trying to improve a relationship, if you're trying to utilize marketing, if you're trying to utilize various ethical forms of persuasion or influence, if you're engaging in power dynamics so you can get things done, that requires a quote unquote higher training age of how we utilize or deploy our communication. And that stuff we're not taught, right? We have physics 101, physics 202, all these things. How many of us have taken some form of rhetoric? And then not only that, maybe if we did, it was in a classroom setting, or maybe it was a rah-rah leadership seminar. How did you start to improve and hone in the way you acquire and deploy language, and how that fits into, I know something you've written about, and we've talked about, optimality theory.
Yeah. Actually, this fits in really well with the second part of a previous question.
Yeah.
Where did I find myself? Did I have a moment where I was like, whoa, I have a lot of growing to do? And actually that happened around the same time that I was looking into starting to learn more about linguistics. So in college, I've always been interested in writing and love doing it and everything. So I thought what I should do is be an English major and a philosophy major. And then I did a creative writing minor as well. So I had these different realms where I'm learning about communication, and I'm learning about the relationship between communication and existence and these kinds of things. And my assumption was that to be like at the sort of like the peak of what a good communicator is to write like Tennyson, or to speak like, orders that we're studying from like classical times. And those are just examples that popped out of my head in the moment. But I had this idea that good writing was this incredibly cerebral, very kind of academic thing, and that good communication was that as well. And what I started learning as I kind of delved into linguistics more, and especially when I was a teacher, is no, that's actually not that's kind of that's an idea that isn't necessarily good for anybody. And certainly, you know, for me, it was a way to be exposed to different types of language and communication over the years and stuff. But what I realized is that within kind of the field of communication, the different elements and skills that you need are like diffuse across many different almost departments, academic departments. Because I think it's helpful to learn things like composition and rhetoric, but at the same time, it's also really helpful to learn things like, you know, just some linguistics, some like, hey, how does language really work? But then to also have kind of the art of communication and to look at like people today that are innovating in incredible ways within communication, and to think about how many different kind of like communities and cultures within different countries, especially the United States, like what different dialects look like and how those dialects work, and why, like how dialects relate to one another, how language is really just, you know, languages are all really dialects at the end of the day. There's a quote that I think is really appropriate, and it talks about how languages are just dialects with an army and a navy, you know. So really what everybody speaks is something that's incredibly fluid. It can evolve over time. It's influenced by what other people speak nearby, and it kind of emerges from what life looks like, from like the day-to-day life of someone speaking a language. And so that was kind of the aha moment for me, was there is so much more to what language is, and what quote unquote good language is not what I've been taught, you know, throughout the years. And it's not to say those writers are bad. It's just to say that there's so much more out there. So that's one thing I would say is the different kind of elements of communication. It's almost like what I've been doing is really like picking from different disciplines and kind of like bringing insights from those disciplines together to grow as a communicator, which I plan to do my whole life.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, no, you touch on a lot of interesting points there. The last thing you said there is making sure that you reach across disciplines. And I think about that when you read about ancient societies and what have you. And let's just use a classic example of the Greeks, right? When people would converse, whether that was in courtyards or wherever they would meet and join, you had so many people from different backgrounds. And I remember a big wake-up call for me when I started to analyze my communication, the people that I spent the most time around, is I started to get this hunger to be around people in more professions, you know, just as you grow. And, you know, it's a big reason why with our workshops, we open them up to everything. And that was a tricky exercise in and of itself, I'll say, where I had to grow as a communicator, like to share some inadequacies on mine, is I had to deal with the fact that, like, I never liked the idea of marketing early on, but then I realized we were hosting these workshops called the Apprenticeship Communication Workshops, and we're like, they're open to all fields. This is about communication. It's about interpersonal skills. It's about constraints. It's about understanding how to improvise and what have you, just like we do daily life. But I would always run into the problem of people thinking that because my background was a strength and conditioning coach, that these and my products were for strength and conditioning coaches. And so I was like, all right, how can I communicate this more clearly? And it was interesting because my constraints were the following, right? And this is not exhaustive. It was one, the attention span of the listener, right? And the mediums that I had to communicate on. So you inevitably, I couldn't use pretty language because maybe people learned about our workshops when scrolling on Instagram or what have you, and you just got to hook them. Another thing is you have to go against your pre-existing bias of all I see is what there is, right? I'm used to strength and conditioning content from this guy. Therefore, anything that I think he puts out is going to be strength and conditioning content. But then we also had to assuage any of their own insecurities of, wow, a workshop timeout where we're going to go get evaluated by other people in other fields and we're going to have our thought processes challenged. I don't know if I'm ready for that. It gets very uncomfortable. So it was interesting to try to figure out the words and the messaging and the marketing style we needed in order to manage this. And for a while I leaned on being rational, right? I thought about, hey, we all think we're better at communication than we really are. Kind of how we started this episode, but where do we learn it? How do we grow it? But it made people think too much. And so then I had to start kind of asking, well, what do you guys think? Talk about theory of mind. What do you think is great communication, and what do you value, and how could you get better at it? And people would start to give me the language that that resonated with them. Well, I want diverse feedback. I want connection. I want real life situations. I want transferability. Ding, ding, ding. We start thinking about these things. We're like, of course, those are the words we use now. So, I didn't want you to have to, strip yourself bare and say, hey, these are the things that I've learned and I've struggled with. I think the fun of it is, even as much as you and I love these things, I struggled with it. And it goes back to Occam's razor. The best solution is usually the simplest. Figure out their language. And that's why I love what you said about academic writing, not always the best example. Academic writing can be very snobbish, and that's not, I understand the context. Sometimes it has to be, but you turn some people off if you don't know how to use their language. And then it's like, well, how do I feel ethically about that? And that's kind of my next question, and feel free to mix it in with any responses to what I just said, is like, how do you balance, like, what if the language you have to use to connect with somebody is language that you feel conflicted by? How do you battle those demons? Does that make sense? Is that a clear question?
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just give you a scenario and make sure
Please.
that we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking like, let's say I'm communicating with a client who is someone that won't respect my knowledge unless I know this, unless I use kind of like an academic tone.
100%.
Yeah. So, and given that, like, for me, one of my biggest, missions in life is to really empower people to use the language that's theirs. We don't have to we don't have to always kind of default to or strive for whatever the verb is, this like very kind of rigid, cold, confining academic language. So given that I have kind of that ethical framework that I'm working with, I would say, in the end, for me, it really depends on like what the person and I are trying to accomplish. If the end of what we're trying to accomplish is kind of within my ethical, like I feel good about it, then I will totally adjust my language. And through that also potentially, like if there's places where, let's say with this person, they want to produce a book, something like this, that's supposed to bring an issue to light. I will show them that I'm willing to speak in the language they're comfortable with, but then also challenge that and say, I don't think that this book will have the biggest impact that it can possibly have if we only use this kind of language. Are you comfortable with me showing you some other ways that this could be communicated? So I think it depends on the end,
Yeah, no, I think that's so you're a believer in, and I'm this is a trick question, right? Because I know you can dig this. So you saying it depends on the end. You think the language that we use can be just a means to the end. Do you think that the end justifies the means then?
Okay, so not in every circumstance. So then
you knew I had to do that to you. You knew I had to throw you in the gray area there.
Yeah, no, I think there is absolutely language that is not ethical ever to use.
Sure.
And then there's also language that's not kind to use ever. And just as an example, with this same, let's take this same client, and let's say that like they are someone that will not take me seriously unless I yell at them or something. I don't know. So in that case, like if someone's wanting me to yell at them, then there's like, that is where I draw the, like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to communicate in a way that's not kind, because that's just, I won't do it. So
yeah, I think that's a great example where I can totally relate. And, I referred to this colloquially as like talking in color in conscious coaching. I just said, you've got to make these words or the imagery come to light. But I remember, to your point, when I train athletes, like I'm not going to smack an athlete. And I had an athlete that one time was gearing up for a max effort squat, was like, hit me. And I'm like, no, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm I'm pretty direct in the weight room, right? Like I don't go out of my way to be something I'm not, but I kind of, I ebb and flow with my level of presence. I can be, a commanding presence when I need to be, and I need to get people's attention. And there's some days you could come watch me coach and you're like, whoa, you're very chill, because depending on the relationship of the athlete. But this individual had trained at a school where the strength coach would kind of use smelling salts and also give him a back slap or just even smack him on the butt, whatever. I'm like, I'm not doing that, and more importantly, if that's what you need, that's concerning. And I could start to play this against them a little bit. And I look at this as ethical manipulation. I'm like, you're in the NFL, you're a grown ass man. If you need me to come smack you a little bit, as opposed to you understanding that you got a family to provide for and a job to do, then let's get with it. And he was like, damn, that's worse than a smack. All right, I got you. And he got into it. And so I think sometimes even just like, I'm with you. It's like, I'm not going to smack an athlete just because, that might juice them up. It's like, well, we shouldn't necessarily have to stoop to that. And so, I think we're on the same page there without a doubt. Am I interpreting this correctly?
Totally. Yeah. And I think there's just so much, like there are those hard and fast, like, no, okay, this is never okay. And this will always be something that I view as a transgression of like my ethical code. But within communication, because it's so fluid and it is just a social contract, and it requires so many different kind of like psychological functions, cognitive functions at once, there's a lot that's gray, honestly. And like a big example for me, like of kind of a gray area would be, in general, I try to communicate directly, and it's really important to me to communicate directly. And I've had bosses in my past where if I was too direct, that would send them off in a direction that's not productive for me or them or anybody else in the office. So I would approach a situation a little more obliquely. And while that's not my preference, it's also not a gross transgression of like any ethical code. And it's in the interest of like efficiency and effectiveness. So there's a lot of gray.
Hey guys, we'll get back to the conversation with Courtney in a moment. One thing's true, regardless of a skill you're trying to learn, you cannot fake reps that you haven't gotten. And that is the core essence of our apprenticeship communication workshops, which are back on. We are going to Phoenix, Arizona, Dallas, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, Seattle, Washington, Nashville, Tennessee. All of these dates, all of the specifics can be found at artofcoaching.com/apprenticeship. We have listeners from more than 20 countries. I constantly get asked, when are your apprenticeships back on? They are live. Just go to artofcoaching.com/apprenticeship. Scroll down to upcoming events to find out when they're coming to your city or a city near you. These are the first research-backed events of their kind that feature opportunities to learn from people across fields on how to be a better communicator, how to wield your words more specifically, tactically, so that you can enhance your chances of getting the job you want, resolving conflicts, and making more progress within not just your life, but your career. Check them out. There's nothing like it. They're for everybody. artofcoaching.com/apprenticeship. All right, back to Courtney.
In general, I try to communicate directly, and it's really important to me to communicate directly. And I've had bosses in my past where if I was too direct, that would send them off in a direction that's not productive for me or them or anybody else in the office. So I would approach a situation a little more obliquely. And while that's not my preference, it's also not a gross transgression of like any ethical code. And it's in the interest of like efficiency and effectiveness. So there's a lot of gray.
Yeah, well, and especially because what's good or bad, and I use air quotes with any of those, depends on the nature of the situation and what happened before it, right? The context. There's a lot of times somebody, I think they don't realize they could walk into the room and see any number of things and they have no idea what's going on. Yet we live in this time now where people feel like metaphorically, right? But also literally, they could walk into the room and see a heated discussion that they know nothing about and hear language, that they don't know what that even means between those two people. And then they've decided if that's ethical or non-ethical. And I think about it very much along the lines of, again, I feel like I was really well prepared for elements of cancel culture because as a coach, sometimes we'd have people come observe, right? And they may see me. I'll never forget one time working with an athlete. I was using a certain modality. And the next thing you know, this person that had come and observed said, great day observing Coach Brett B, yada, yada, yada. But then basically there was a video and people were like, oh, I'm surprised to see him using this exercise, or I'm surprised to see this. And the research says that. And I remember seeing that 4 days later and I go, time out. Do any of you know anything about this athlete that I'm coaching? Do any of you know their medical history? Here's the deal. Oh, well, we didn't know that. And I go, of course you didn't. So why would you feel like you could comment on that? But we do that every day in society now. We have this polarized environment. How do you navigate, what about all these people now? And we have plenty of them in our audience that are listening. They have knowledge. They're great people. They're imperfect people like all of us. But they say, I want to share. I want to put myself out there. Maybe it's a podcast, it's a book, it's this or that. But shit, I'm worried about being judged. I'm going to get torn down. I feel like it's a matter of time till I say something and people come at me. Is there any hope for this? Or are people just supposed to stay in their shell now because it's like they have imposter phenomenon that's bad enough. And now they have to worry about people jumping on them. And it's not just judgment, right? It's hyper judgment these days.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, one of the reasons I think it's become so difficult for people that are in different spheres to communicate with one another is because of social media and what that does to communication. And there's always the algorithms, right? So people are being fed content that is basically in line with their cognitive biases and is kind of feeding them information that either they like or they really hate. So it's getting them to engage. And either way, people are developing. I mean, it's it is truly separate languages. And so there is I felt this fear before as well, that I might say something that is in my everyday life, in my experience with my interactions online and in the real world, it would be a statement that is totally positive. But for someone else who's been kind of steeped in this another way of communicating, it might seem really negative. And how do I bridge that gap? It is something that I think about a lot. And so to kind of speak to your audience members, the first thing I'd say is I totally share that fear. And the second thing that I'd say is, the thing that helps me the most is just being very clear on what my values are, and just kind of coming back to those often within my communications. So if I'm writing something that goes on social media, for example, just hey, does this kind of match up with everything? Yeah. Okay. So this is checking all of my boxes. I feel if someone said this to me, I would feel very positively about this, or whatever reaction you're looking for. And then watch what happens. They're if you do receive kind of those nasty comments and people that are eviscerating you or whatever it may be for whatever reason, I think kind of okay, looking at that from almost a scientific perspective, all right, that's some feedback. Where, what is the context of this person's feedback? If they're coming to me from a sort of a group of people that speaks almost like a different language than me, what can I learn about their language from this interaction? And then to also recognize the positives too, because I'm sure you're saying these people are audience, you're good people. And so you are going to get positive feedback as well. and making sure, I think we all have this bias towards kind of the negative, which probably stems from like times when it was much more important to know like that snake's poisonous than there's great food behind that bush. And so just remembering that, the positives are real, and it is important that people have positive reactions. I would say that's kind of like the best for right now. And honestly, I'm still learning and trying to think about this as well myself. So
no,
it's kind of the best I got.
I loved your example about, I love the example of, hey, that snake's poisonous, as opposed to there's great food behind that bush. I think one thing that was cathartic for me dealing with this, to add on to what you're saying, is learning more about it, right? When I started learning more about constructs like Schadenfreude, which I still owe my audience a whole episode on that. Or even there was a book I remember reading called Crystallizing Public Opinion. And there's this quote that always stays with me. And it's not a genius quote, we know it, but it's just helpful to be reminded. And they said a debate will always draw a larger crowd than a lecture. And so you talked about this, with the algorithm, is that, believe me, these organizations, and it's not just the algorithm, because if social media was gone, something would take its place, right? Before that, it was newspapers and other things that people thought were rotting the minds of others, or magazines. But I mean, they wrote about this in 1918. They said nothing so easily catches attention or creates a crowd like a contest of any kind, right? You think about what were the conversations in ancient Rome when they had the Colosseum. Of course, we know that people turned out in droves to watch that, but I'm sure there were members of that society that looked at that as very much like social media. These blood hungry people, right? But these occasions like these contests, and now social media is its own form of contest, they almost kind of become symbolic, and they like elicit an unconscious and probably conscious alignment with one person or another. And that's very much how we are, right? We want to identify ourselves as the hero and the victor, good over evil. And this kind of breathes into this allegory of our life, because it's funny, like, be the hero of your own story is a lot of these kinds of mantras we see today. But it's problematic when we think we're the hero, but we're really the villain. And we're just following these things that create news value. And we prefer to read about the things we like. I mean, again, how many coaches do you know? And I know we know a lot that if they could, they just learn all about training and exercise, just like there's accountants that would only learn about this, or there's doctors that would prefer. But what about the dentist that now needs to learn how to manage their books, and the coach that now needs to manage, people in their gym, or, there's some kind of social disparity going on in the locker room that's impacting team performance. We don't like dealing with the messiness within ourselves. Any thoughts on that? I know that was a rant, but I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And I think the first thing that makes me think of is this concept of like, the people. Largely, I think when you're trying to have integrity in the way that you're communicating about content, no matter what field you're in, I would argue that you're probably going to end up in a situation where it's much more complex than 240 characters, or however long your Instagram caption can be until people stop reading. It's much too complex for this kind of like short form copy that is kind of the cornerstone of marketing today. And that's not to knock copywriting at all. That's not to say that short form writing is bad, but it is to say a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they're trying to market or communicate about a concept. The concept is complex as hell. And then they have this space that does not fit the complexity of what they're trying to say. So what happens is, in order to draw boundaries around this very complex, almost murky in a good way, thing, people will say what the thing isn't. And when you're saying like, whether you're in fitness and you're saying like, hey, we're not, this is just an example, but like, sure. Or actually this isn't a pertinent example. So my husband owns a gym, and At the gym, we do strength sports. We also do strength and conditioning
And
classes.
give them the name of the gym. Sorry to butt in, but I want them to know the name so they can support it.
Oh, thank you. Strength Ratio in Asheville. And there's sort of an online component as well. But anyway, with both the online and the on-site, an issue that we ran into a lot is that when people walked into the gym and saw barbells and saw people doing clean and jerks and snatches or deadlifts, squats, and bench presses, immediately they thought, oh, you're a CrossFit gym. And it became kind of challenging to say, like, no, we're strength sports and we have this strength and conditioning component for those that are not interested in competing in strength sports. And eventually we had to start saying we're not what we are is not CrossFit. We kind of had to start there. And what can happen, I think, especially with things that are very fraught, topics that are very contentious today, people will say, well, who I am is a not blah. I'm not on the right. I'm not on the left. Or you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not, I don't support red. I don't support blue, because maybe saying what you do support is more complicated. So it becomes this easy way to express who you are. And I think that kind of feeds the beast.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example, especially because, and it's funny because what a wonderful, and you mentioned like using the term pertinent example before CrossFit, what would they have said about that gym, right? Because they'd be like, oh, this is a hardcore gym, or this is you mentioned deadlifts, a powerlifting gym, or if they saw the clean and jerk, oh, this is a weightlifting gym. And really the general public didn't know the difference between those things, whatsoever. I mean, CrossFit isn't it hasn't been around that long that people prior to that didn't know what that meant. And so it's funny that now that term becomes this. And I just remember even back when I started training athletes, we would do GPP circuits just to do a little training nerdery here. And, I remember the first time we were doing a circuit just to improve somebody's general capacity. For those of you listening, not in the field, it's just raising one's fitness level, which don't think of fitness as the popular idea of fitness. Fitness is basically an organism's ability to do a task. So athletes can come in deconditioned. We have to do high volume general work. It might be a circuit. It might be a barbell complex or what have you. Now, if you do a circuit or a complex, that's CrossFit. I'm like, well, no, these principles were around quite a while before then. Just kind of if somebody, we think of the internet and HTML and code or whatever, there's terms we use around that are new terms, but they're really older concepts. And I remember somebody saying, tell me what year somebody created and I'll tell you what it was called before then. But building into this, and you talked about writing, and something you do very well, have written, read some of your work, and we're working together, right? Like for the audience, hey, spoiler alert, Courtney is a contributing editor to my next book. And so we wanted to put that one in there. But, you have really helped me as well, because I got caught into some habits with writing, especially as I'm even still working my way through some burnout and what have you. Writing, when we talk about the medium, certain mediums of communication can really kind of take it out of me more than others. Mm-hmm. Having conversations like this fills my cup. There's certain times when writing fills my cup. There's other times where, depending on other life stressors, writing is more likely than a conversation to also drain me, because there's so much. If we have people listening, what are some exercises that can help them improve their writing in general so they can complete specific tasks more efficiently if they're not the kind of author you are or the kind of writer you are? Because that's another mode of communication that's intimidating to people, but they want to use these context-rich mediums. So would you mind going into that a little bit if you're comfortable?
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting. I think one of the things about writing is that it's a lifelong practice. It's something that people evolve with and improve over the entire courses of their lives. It's a reason why you're still considered a very young author when you're between 45 and 50. And so, I think that's, on the one hand, it's really exciting because it's a realm where there's growth that can live alongside you, which is really cool. But on the flip side, it can also feel very intimidating that this is a skill where there's literally, like Hemingway said, we're all apprentices in a craft where no one is a master. So mastery is kind of, depends on how you look at it on a philosophical level, but from the way I look at it is, you are always trying to get it, but you're never going to get there. And that excites me, but it's also intimidating.
Sure.
and I think, for one thing that I have recognized, especially, with working with my husband and seeing how much writing he produces throughout the day as a fitness business owner, whether it's copy for social media posts or emails or client communications, prospect communications. There's just so much throughout the day that a coach or a fitness business owner or any leader is writing. When it's a process that doesn't feel comfortable, when it feels draining, that can be a huge impediment in your day. And I know that coaches, leaders, what have you, like there's just so much else that you need to work on. Having writing be this thing that's like this kind of behemoth project that's like standing in the way of you connecting with a client can be really frustrating and can like kind of perpetuate that cycle of like, oh, I don't want to do this and it's frustrating me and now it's taking me longer because I have this negative emotion associated with it and all of this stuff. And so what I would say, I think with writing, there's no like quick hacks or anything like this, like with most skills. But one of the biggest things is actually reading fiction that you like. And I know that it seems like, okay, when are you going to have time in the day to add? You're already reading the books that you need for whatever your business is or your
trade.
Clients need you to read, what have you. Now I'm asking you to put fiction on top of that. But I guess what I mean to say is if you can fit it in even like before bed or like first thing in the morning, or maybe replace if you watch TV at night, maybe replace a little bit of that with some reading, and to choose an author whose writing you like. It doesn't have to be someone that's considered like a class, like part of the literary canon or anything like that. Just someone whose writing you like, and read that and enjoy it, and don't put any pressure on it. And when you get the opportunity, find a passage that you really enjoy. I have a really good friend who I helped with this, and she loved Chuck Palahniuk. And I don't know, for anyone that's not familiar, he's like famous for these really long, really like gross paragraphs that are like totally like too descriptive. They make you uncomfortable. They're incredibly descriptive. Fight Club's one of his books and stuff. And anyway, she came across a passage that she thought was like delightfully out there. And so so what you do is you find a passage, you literally copy it word for word. I recommend handwriting because it slows you down. It doesn't have to be too long, but as you're copying what you're reading, what you're doing there is engaging with the text on a deeper level and starting to just reinforce this process of storing different types of syntax, like sentence structures, word usage, voices. You're storing that in your mind and you can use it later. And so that's really the first thing that I would say is like, read something you love. I recommend fiction because in fiction, the writing is kind of the thing, so the writing you can find writing that is kind of across the board. So it's easier to find something that you really connect with, I think. And then writing down a passage word for word when you have the opportunity can really help.
Yeah. Oh, keep going.
No, sorry. So that was going to be the first thing that I would say. And it's also a creative writing. It's like a staple in creative writing too, in terms of an exercise that you'll do if you pursue creative writing, it'll pop up somewhere. And another thing that I would highly recommend is just when you can to seek out some feedback on like from someone that you trust, who's maybe not, like you said, not, family or a close friend, but someone who has a sort of a skill with communication that respect and you look up to, just to ask them every now and again, like, hey, what did you think about this post that I wrote? Or what do you think about this email? And just really like kind of opening yourself up to feedback on your writing, when you have the time, I think is also really important. And it can be brutal sometimes. Like I think the other thing about creative writing is that like, it really, it's an exercise in getting a really thick skin because that is so important to be able to have this kind of feedback that's honest about something that you've produced linguistically, and to hear the good, but also to hear the bad. And then to know that it's not personal and to sort of divorce yourself a little bit from what you've produced so that you can, again, see it from this like almost scientific perspective. Like, okay, how can I use this to help me grow and improve?
Yeah, I think writing down some notes of what you said, and I'm really grateful that you didn't give the classic toss-up advice of how to be a better writer. And I want to think about how to say this as concisely as possible, but this is a conversation, right? I think where I struggled a lot is one, let's just talk about the old cliche of like time management, right? I found that I very much am a believer in managing energy instead of time. So I love Stephen Pressfield. I love kind of, there are many writers that I enjoy in terms of their own take on how to be a better writer. So like the war of art and things like that. But generally when you hear certain writers talk about, or authors talk about writing, it's, commit to it, find a time, do this, disable distractions, what have you. And that's all who am I to say that's not good information? But for people that are multi-passionate, or folks like your husband who you mentioned, and what I learned how I was judging myself inappropriately, that ain't my day job. My day job, I think some people forget, and maybe it's helpful for some of the audience out there. There's folks like the Malcolm Gladwells of the world, and there's folks like, and name your author, right? Kind of a popular author. They get an advance that allows them to sit and write. They get paid in the pontification stage. They may get research assistance. They'll get help from the publisher. That's what they get to do. So where I burnt myself out and I thought of myself too critically is I was like, well, why can't I can't turn this off. I can't do that. All this noise is entering my life and it's making my writing crappy. And I'm listening to these people's advice, but I can't do it. I can't turn my phone off. My dad might have a stroke because he's got heart problem. And I was just like, oh my God, dude, quit listening to this shit because it's not for you. It's well-intentioned, but like, you've just got to manage your time, or you've got to manage your energy. Write when you feel like writing. And somebody would say, well, that's not good advice because you got to sit down and you've got to make it, the muse isn't always going to find you or whatever. But I just think it goes to this one size fits all advice that has permeated a lot of things, and you can't always escape it, right? Like I said, these authors are usually giving this advice with great intentions, just like you are. But why I'm glad you didn't go that route is because not everybody can utilize that, because how many of us can afford to just have one job? How many of us are getting $300,000 advances? How many of us are doing these things where we can just sit and write and focus? Sometimes you have to create and wonder and explore and read fiction. And I know there's been some times where going on your fiction, like I watched an episode of Game of Thrones and I'm like, oh shit, that brought me right back to something I taught at a workshop. Content machines rolling again, sit down and write. I think another thing that helped, and I'd be interested on your take on this, and this is my own self-discovery, is you have to give yourself permission to not hold yourself to the same expectations every time you do something. Meaning, I'm still very much caught up on I think about my doctoral thesis right now. I'm spending way too much time trying to make it perfect, to the point that I wasn't going off of the assumption of knowledge. I was just explaining everything, inciting everything and all this. Or when I wrote an email, I run a communication company. I want to make sure every email was warm and what have you. But then I started to realize, put some boundaries on it, Brett. And I'd tell people, just like when I interact with you, when we started working together, I said, hey, Courtney, you might sometimes get texts or emails that are abrupt. It may not always have perfect grammar. I'm not going to be, crazy sloppy, but there are many times where I'm running through an airplane terminal or what have you. I just need a mutual agreement here that you understand that I might be brief. I'm not trying to be rude. And your just acknowledgement of that saved me energy so that when I had to write the bigger projects or the social media copy or my newsletter copy, I had given less of myself away with this standard of perfectionism somewhere else. So I could give more of myself to this. Does that make sense, or am I speaking gibberish?
Yeah, totally. And this is something that I think is so important. Is this concept that um, and this is something that I think about a lot, where your best writing happens. When I say best, I'm not necessarily saying like it's perfect in whatever way you define it. I'm actually saying like writing that's going to help you grow. That happens in this kind of like, in between having a deadline and having the time to think through things. The deadline is important. It's important because it's going to stop you from going down those rabbit holes of like, oh no, this isn't as good as something I produced before. How do I make it better? I need to redo it. I need to structure it a different way. That kind of thinking is not going to promote growth. Ultimately, it's not about every single piece of writing being perfect. It's about continuing to produce content. It's about continuing to get feedback on your content. And it's also about kind of experimenting with different, trying on different types of sentence styles. If you haven't tried different ways of kind of structuring your sentences or different voices or what have you. I think in a way, like it's you need kind of like the right amount of pressure, but not too much, right? Like there's times when you can have not enough, you just don't have enough time to write what you want to write. And honestly, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If your job is different, than if you're not a writer and you have other things that you're doing, it's okay that you don't have that much time to produce, content. Like as long as you're producing the content and it's within the realm of like, someone's going to perceive this and understand what I need them to perceive. They're not going to see this and be confused. That's okay. And I think just like, there's so much, I don't know, snobbery is not necessarily the right word, but like there's just a lot of pressure, I think, on writing and what it should be. And I think just like anything, it has to fit. It has to fit you and it has to fit the circumstance. And so, my advice for someone who's wanting to become more efficient and effective with their writing, because they also have other things that they're doing throughout the day, again, it's read fiction, or like you said, like interact with media that you like and like really kind of be there for it, really like enjoy it, because the more language you're kind of immersing yourself in, the better. You can't go wrong there. So just enjoy some good books, enjoy some good, well-written TV shows. There's like a ton out there right now. And I think the other piece is, kind of see deadlines as like, they're actually going to help you. They're going to kind of take away this impetus to make everything perfect. And I mean, not all my writing is, there are times when I've posted things and I notice, oh, there's a typo, or there's a spelling error. Well, bummer, but I didn't have very much time to do it. And I had a lot of other things to do throughout the day, and my message still got across. I think that the last piece of advice, which I want to make sure I hit on because it's been so helpful for me, has also been to, if you have like Grammarly, spell check, an online thesaurus, all of these tools that can help expedite writing, my advice is to use them as a check. Don't use them in the process of writing, because you don't want to get to a place where you rely on them. And the biggest example of this is something actually, Brett, I was talking to you about before, where I had to work on my squats because I had learned how to use the balance at the bottom to safely lift more weight. But then I was using it all the time and it became this crutch. And then I didn't have confidence in myself as a squatter with different kind, like say if I was using a safety squat bar, for example, or if I was practicing like typically I high bar squat, but if I was practicing low bar, like then all of a sudden, like I'm bringing my weight way down because I don't know how to use the bounce. And if I was in a place where if I couldn't use that bounce, then I just didn't have confidence. And the reason this is so important in writing is every single time you sit at your computer and think really hard about the right word and like just think through it. Maybe you write down a bunch of synonyms and until you get to the right one, that's creating a neural pathway that you need. That's helping you become more efficient at pulling different types of, like basically like using more of your lexicon, using more of this like library of syntax that you have stored. And I'm not saying like not to knock Grammarly or Thesaurus or anything like this, but if you use that in real time, if you say like, I want a word that's like glib, but that's not glib. And like, you just type in, you're training yourself to do that instead of going back into your reservoir of knowledge that you already have. And if you, at first it's super, oh my gosh, there's moments where literally I'm like banging my head against the wall. Like, why can't I think of this word? Why? But the more you do it, the faster you get at it. So in the long run, it makes you more efficient than relying on the sort of technological kind of assistance.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but definitely, I mean, for sure. For example, my biggest weakness, I'm not a great speller at all. Never have been there. So that's something where like I turn spell check off when I write the first time, but then I turn it on and I see everything I've spelled wrong. But at least I've like given myself a chance to practice kind of spelling correctly, using my own kind of skill set, using my own neurology, and then to kind of then before I deliver, like Brett, if I was editing and, didn't check the spelling, then I might deliver something to you that's riddled with spelling errors. So that's not what I want to do. So use the tools, but just use them as a check.
Yeah. And I'm glad you used that example. I remember even just working with Conscious Coaching when we had uploaded it through CreateSpace, which is now part of Kindle Direct Publishing. And their technology like jumbled a bunch of words. So even though we had several editors gone through it, we had gone through it, we uploaded the manuscript, just as it should be, or some of our early copies. And this was back in 2017. People were getting some misspellings, right? Like, and I remember one was talking about goals and the word timely was supposed to, it ended up being like rhymely. And people were, putting stuff on social media like, love this book, but then they DM me and be like, hey man, quick heads up, there's an error on page like 89. I'm like, what? And I look at our manuscript and ours was fine. And we had to go back and forth with Amazon so much because nothing's worse than having to run a correction. We had these books going out all over the world and it was like, it was just odd because it was a technological issue. I reached out to even some of and I was like, no. And it made me smile because Maria Popova from Brain Pickings wrote this, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but she goes, and I'm quoting her, yes, sometimes those spellings are hard. The president of Turkmenistan is Gurbanguly Malik Gulievich Berdy Muhammadov, but believe me, nothing's worse than running a correction. And if you think that name was hard for me to pronunciate, you should look at how it's spelled. But her point was like, you just got to slow that down. And I think sometimes like, it's like, don't try to impress people either by bringing in these esoteric facts. I think and I think almost this TED style of writing has done this. I started to notice, almost this, what's the word I want to look for? It was a formulaic thing of somebody must have told people the key to writing a best-selling book is tell a story about some, leader we've heard throughout history, and then make sure there's an interesting fact that somebody really didn't know. Like maybe, hey, Steve Jobs had a phobia of buttons. That's why he wore these black turtlenecks. That's really part of the reason why the iPhone didn't have buttons. Or like tell something that's kind of captivating, then extract some lessons from it, and then be like, you too can be like this person. And then, the books that I'd kind of read from a lot of these TED Talk folks, it was almost the same thing. They'd lean on all these interesting stories, but at the end you felt, okay, these are cool stories, but like, what can I actually utilize? Right? Like this was very hard. And the point I'm making from that is I remember another piece of advice is like being proleptic, of like this Greek word that comes from anticipation. Like sometimes you need stories in a book for sure. And I understand their allure. Like storytelling is a huge cultural force. But sometimes you just need to get to the major objection of what somebody would say about the argument and raise it in advance, right? Like part of the book we're working on together, right, is about the gray area in leadership, how it's messy, and you're not always going to be able to make decisions that everybody thinks are going to agree with. But guess what? Welcome to the field. Like welcome to what it means to have skin in the game. And it's not a matter of what's good or bad. It's about the full story or compositional exposition of what leadership is. And guess what? It's the gray area. And if people sometimes would just try to get to the damn point of what they're saying and make a simple argument instead of trying to impress, I think that can help too. But we're all guilty of it because we're so scared, myself included, that the reader's not going to be entertained within 10 minutes. Like, I mean, think about how many times you tell a friend, oh, check out this show. They're like, yeah, I watched one episode. I didn't really do it. I'm like, what the hell are you going to learn in one episode? Like, give it at least 5. I couldn't get into Mad Men at the beginning. I couldn't get into The Wire. I couldn't get into it. And then eventually when I gave them 5 or 6 episodes, I'm like, now but people don't read the first 100 pages anymore. They want to be entertained right away, which is why people go to these saccharine type sugar rush books that they give you a cute quote, but then the rest of it is just like, cool. I hope it looks good on your bookshelf,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this circles back to what we had talked about before with this, like, with more polarization and with people speaking different languages, it's almost like, and when I say that, I don't mean like different. I mean,
yeah,
like
we know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
my audience, they should know what you mean. Otherwise they're listening to the wrong podcast.
But yeah, so I think that really goes back to it. And so there's this kind of, it's this like place in journalism and writing, this kind of ethical conundrum that happens where, you say like, hey, I have this message, but I need, like, the message is basically a moot point unless it gets to anybody's ears. In the world that we live in, people's, are sort of trained now to interact with writing that's incredibly short and like punchy and to the point. And again, not to knock it, but like that's what, for some people, that's like the only writing they're encountering. So anything different, when you're an author, when you're a reporter, a journalist, what have you, you're running the risk of losing the person before the message can get to them.
Yeah.
And there's sort of 2 ways that this can happen. I mean, there's the first way, which is attention, but then there's the second way, which is, you've accidentally like referred to something that might trigger a very negative reaction for this person and then cause them to stop reading. And I would say, like, in the same way that there's a lot of gray area, there's concessions that you have to make as an author and a reader and a journalist. Sometimes you have to have an article that's a little bit more, quote unquote sensational, because you need people to, like, it's a message that's really important that you need people to understand. But sometimes if the message is sensational and then it actually doesn't reflect what you're trying to say, well, now you've gone too far. Now you've crossed over the boundary. You're out of the gray and you're into something there's no integrity, there's no fidelity to what you actually wanted to communicate. And I think similarly, there's there's a point where like, referring to whether it's a national event or something like this, like sometimes you have to refer to these things, and knowing that they're highly polarizing topics, it can be scary to include that within writing, because you don't want people to see like this national event and then to stop reading your book because they're like, oh no, I don't want to hear what this person has to say. But if that national event is an example of something that you're trying to communicate and it's a critical example, then you have to kind of see if there's a way to kind of like soften the blow, but still include what you have to include. And if someone's going to put your book down because of a mention and not actually read the context around that, that's a bummer. But you can't, it's like the old saying goes, like, you can't write for everyone, because then you're not writing anything. You have to write to your ideal kind of audience in mind. And that means sometimes you're making concessions. In some places you're shortening things up, you're cutting some copy, and you're kind of like heightening up the sensationalism. And then other times you're saying like, I'm sorry, I can't do that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Very, very well said, because it's, again, this tenet that people accept facts that come to them through existing familiar or comfortable channels, right? We know that people like to hear new things or even old things in a custom ways. So to your point, yeah, if they're reading, and we mentioned it in the work that we're doing together, right? There are aspects of national events, because this book is coming out, even though I didn't want to have a new book come out for another 3 years or what have you. There was too many things that went on during COVID and what have you that presented this understanding of gray area and the importance of communication. And so, right, there's examples that we give in things like education and sport, and there also are national events. And I'm not a heavily political person from the sense of like I'm involved, right? Like I vote and do those things. But like if you were to come over to dinner, I'm not going to be like, so who wants to talk politics, right? Like that's not like we're definitely involved with caring about the things that we should care about. But people, any hint of these things, it's like they don't want to talk about it. It's like, well, listen, you can't hide from everything. And we need to have, when I raise my son, one of the first things I'm going to teach him is just like, hey, you need to be able to converse on a wide array of topics. That's part of being a gentleman, right? Because he's a boy. And that's just part of being a well-rounded human being, is you need to do these things. And right, like I shouldn't have said that, because now there'll be people that'll be like, well, just because he's a boy doesn't mean he's a gentleman. I don't have time for that kind of shit. But the point being is, people have to broaden the ambit of their concerns. They have to broaden the ambit of their interests. They have to broaden the ambit of their communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And I think, that part of, we're always coming back to communication is social. Communication involves at least two people, probably more. And so just like anything that's social or that involves multiple people, there's a give and take. There's concessions that the producer of the communication has to make, but then there's also concessions that the receiver has to make. Just like in the leadership dynamic, there's accountability that a leader has to have, and there's accountability that the follower has to have. And it's the same thing in communication. And I think that something that can be really scary is that there's just so much, especially in the realm of social media, there's so much pressure on the producer of the communication to make everything right for every possible viewer.
So annoying.
Yeah, but there's no accountability for the receiver.
No.
Right. And so that's really important, because, again, like, just as an example, if I encounter something on social media and it like I bristle because of something I've read, I can't just fire back right away and say like, hey, this is wrong or something like this. And of course, this is just like anything else. Like, there's a lot of gray, but then there's also boundaries. Like, there's things that some people can say where I'm like, no, that's wrong. No. But I'm talking about like gray areas. So something that kind of makes me uncomfortable or bristle or whatever. Before I react, like, I need to take a step back and like think about why am I reacting that way? Need to like, it's not that I'm invalidating my reaction, just to say like, why? Like to investigate that a little bit, to investigate the producer of the communication. Like, okay, well, where do I think they're coming from? And that's an exercise that I think needs, like, social media isn't a great platform for, sorry, I'm on my soapbox about social media.
No,
I didn't mean to.
You're fine. It's about communication. Yeah.
Yeah. But it is, the channel, we talked about the channel and the medium. The channel of social media is one in which it's very, very, very easy, almost minimal effort is required to submit a comment. And what I would just say is, I would just advocate that before a comment is submitted for many of the things that fall into gray area, just to kind of, for the receiver of the communication to just take a beat and like think about it, evaluate it a little bit, and just kind of remembering that like within communication, there's onus on the producer, but there's onus also on the receiver.
I think that's a wonderful message. And it fits into, as we wrap up this show, we always have podcast reflections, right? Allie Kirshner, a member of our staff, does these where for every single episode, and they're always free, people can download these things and do reflections, because we got really tired of people just being like, I go through podcasts, this and this and this, but it's like, okay, well, what are you doing? Right. Cause there's this idea that podcast, creators, all right, I should always put out new episodes, and we're always going to, we love it. Right. But like, oh, I should always have new episodes, or we shouldn't have redundant topics, and we shouldn't do this. And it's like, okay, well, what are you doing with it? What are you doing? Or like when people, like I've started posting less, on Instagram, not necessarily just always in frequency, but like my deeper stuff we put on, talk about channel. We have this app called Marco Polo Channels, and people have to pay for it because we put a lot of time into it, and we have to pay for it. But, we have these courses and other things where we have a higher fidelity content in terms of context and whatever. But then I'll have people that'll be like, well, why don't you put this on social media? It's like, well, I could just as easily ask you, why don't you join these other channels? Because social media there's too many constraints on this. And then I remember one person trying to turn something, well, if you understood it well enough, you should be able to explain to a 6-year-old, and characters shouldn't be, this and that. And I go, okay, well then why don't you ask a musician why they don't do a whole concert on social media? It's not about understanding something well enough. It's also about, again, the fidelity of it. But we could go on for a long time with this. We are going to do a part 2 without a doubt. But in the meantime, as we wrap, where can people learn more about you, support your guys' gym, your work, give us the goods? I'll make sure and put it in the show notes, and then we're going to get you scheduled for a round 2 down the road.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much. People can find me on my website, which is CourtneyKellyWrites.com. And so there I have some of my personal writing, but also information about my writing services. So the copywriting that I do, editing, ghostwriting, stuff like that is also listed there. And in terms of our fitness business, that's Strength Ratio. So you can go to strengthratiohq.com. And you can see there what's offered in terms of on-site training or online services. Yeah, that's really awesome. Thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. And thank you for being willing to go some places that I know can be uncomfortable, and then giving such tactical insight in a warm and personal way. I appreciate working with you. I appreciate you looking over my own shortcomings as I manage one of the most easily hectic periods of my life where I'm overcommitted and always being forgiving and helpful. And it's a pleasure. So we'll get you back for round 2. And guys, for myself and Courtney Kelly, until next time, this has been the Art of Coaching Podcast, signing off.